guys figure it out.
Hare Krishna.
Jaya Radha Madhava Kunjabi Hari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunjabi Hari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari. Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana. Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana. Jamuna Tira Vanachari. Jamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunjabi Hari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunjabi Hari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunjabi Hari. Jaya Srimad Paramahansa Varujikacharya Ashtotar the Sri Srimad His Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jai. ISKCON BBT Founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Varujikacharya Ashtotar the Sri Srimad His Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnavindi Ki Jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Samaveda Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glory to Shri Guru and Gauranga. So I have text 30, is that correct? I think that's correct. I think we read 29. Yes, we definitely read 29. In fact, I wanted to reread that purport because there was a mistake in there. You may have noticed. Okay, I'm just going to read 29, 30, the translation and purport myself, and then we'll go on to 30. Okay. Om Namo Bhagavate, Narayam Namaskritya, Narang Chaiva Narottamam, Devim Saraswatim Vyasam, Tato Jayamudiri. Before reciting the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is our very means of conquest, we should offer our respectful obeisances unto Lord Narayan, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, unto Narayan Rishi, the supermost human being, unto Mother Saraswati, the Goddess of Learning, unto Srila Vyasadeva, the author, and unto Srila Prabhupada, the translator, commentator, and our spiritual master. Nashta Prayesha Badreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavatyuttama Shloke Bhakti Bhavati Naishtiki. By regular attendance in classes on Srimad Bhagavatam and by rendering devotional service to the pure devotee, all that is inauspicious within the heart is destroyed almost to nil, and loving devotion to the Supreme Lord, who is glorified in transcendental songs, is established as an irrevocable fact. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Okay, give me 1 second here. Okay. On this 18th day of October 2021 in San Diego, we're reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, translation and commentary by His Divine Grace HG Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. So I'm just going to review text 29 of chapter 5 of Canto 5 of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and then we'll proceed to text 30. Okay. So 29 said, after accepting the feature of Avaduta, a great saintly person without material cares, Lord Rishabhadeva passed through human society like a blind, deaf, and dumb man, an idle stone, a ghost, or a madman. Although people called him such names, he remained silent and did not speak to anyone. Purport. The word Avaduta refers to one who does not care for social conventions, particularly the Varnashram Dharma, but who is situated within himself, fully satisfied by meditating on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In other words, one who has surpassed the rules and regulations of Varnashram Dharma is called an Avaduta. Such a person has already surpassed the clutches of Maya, and he lives completely separate and independent. So it was a little different yesterday, you may remember. It said it may be situated within himself. No, Prabhupada definitely he is situated. So now text 30, which you also won't read, but I'll read all the Sanskrit. Tatta tatta puragrama karaketa vata karvata shibada vraja gosha sarta girivana shramadi shvanupatam avanacharapasadai padibuyamano makshikabhir iva vanagajas tarjana tadanavame hanastivana grava shakrid rajak prakshepa puti vata duruktais tad aviganayan evasat sangsthana etasmin dehopalakshane sadapadesha ubayanubhava sarupena samahimavastane nasamaropitaham mama bimanatvad avikhandatamana prativim ekachadak pradibabhrama. Synonyms too long. I'll read the translation. Rishabhadeva began to tour through cities, villages, mines, countrysides, valleys, gardens, military camps, cow pens, the homes of cowherd men, transient hotels, hills, forests, and hermitages. Wherever he traveled, all bad elements surrounded him, just as flies surround the body of an elephant coming from a forest. He was always being threatened, beaten, urinated upon, and spat upon. Sometimes people threw stones, stool, and dust at him, and sometimes people passed foul air before him. Thus people called him many bad names and gave him a great deal of trouble, but he did not care about this, for he understood that the body is simply meant for such an end. He was situated on the spiritual platform, and, being in his spiritual glory, he did not care for all these material insults. In other words, he completely understood that matter and spirit are separate, and he had no bodily conception. Thus, without being angry at anyone, he walked through the whole world alone. Purport. Narottam Das Thakur says, Deha smriti nahi yar, sangsara bandhana kahantar. When a person fully realizes that the material body and world are temporary, he is not concerned with pain and pleasures of the body. As Sri Krishna advises in the Bhagavad Gita 2.14, you can all chant along. Matra sparshastu konteha shitoshna sugaduka daha agama pahino nityas tang statikshasva bharata. O son of Kunti, the non-permanent appearance of happiness and distress, and their disappearance in due course, are like the appearance and disappearance of winter and summer seasons. They arise from sense perception, O scion of Bharat, and one must learn to tolerate them without being disturbed. So this is a good place to, before we go on, to review. Who can tell me what scion of Bharat means? Raise your hand. Or raise your hands. Yes, Prabhu. I'm sorry? Descendant. Scion means descendant. It may not be so clear. It's very pertinent now because we're talking about, we're going to be talking about Bharat and his descendants soon. As far as Rishabhadeva is concerned, it has already been explained, idam shariram mama durvi bhavyam. He did not at all possess a material body, and therefore he was tolerant of all the trouble offered to him by the bad elements in society. Consequently, he could tolerate people's throwing stool and dust upon him and beating him. His body was transcendental and consequently did not at all suffer pain. He was always situated in his spiritual bliss. As stated in the Bhagavad Gita 1861, again, those who know it, Ishwarak sarva bhutanam riddesher janatishtati brahmayan sarva bhutani yantrarudhani maya. The Supreme Lord is situated in everyone's heart, O Arjuna, and is directing the wanderings of all living entities who are seated as on a machine made of the material energy. Since the Lord is situated in everyone's heart, he is in the heart of hogs and dogs also. If hogs and dogs in their material bodies live in filthy places, one should not think that the Supreme Personality of Godhead in his Paramatma feature also lives in a filthy place. Although Lord Rishabhadeva was maltreated by the bad elements of the world, he was not at all affected. Therefore it is stated here, Swa Mahima Avastanena. He was situated in his own glory. He was never saddened due to being insulted in the many ways described above. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnanandana Shalakaya Chakshu Unmilatam Mena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. I was born in the darkness of ignorance, but my spiritual master Srila Prabhupada opened my eyes with the torchlight of knowledge. I offer my humble obeisances unto him and to all members of Sri Parampara, the disciplic succession. So, this is an amazing description, startling description of Lord Rishabhadeva's taking of this Avaduta position after these wonderful instructions he's given to his sons, and there's also many others present in that assembly. And now he's, and I had forgotten, frankly, what it said in the previous verse, or one of the previous verses, that he began to show this attitude of a madman, even one within his own family. So you can, yeah, you can imagine the, you know, anyway, it's hard to imagine what was going on at home. But you get the feeling it wasn't long before he left. And he went on, he's touring everywhere, cities, villages, mines, countrysides. One of the things that's startling about this, besides the fact that, I mean, it's one thing to show this kind of tolerance, you know, and we've seen that, of course, in, you know, great souls like Nityananda Prabhu, who also was the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but Prahlad Maharaj, who's a living entity. But here is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. There's no question about it. You know, he's been described in many cases, and also he declared himself that he's Vasudeva. And in spite of that, obviously, people are ignorant of that, but this is going on in an earlier age. Is it Satya Yuga? Something like that. And here's all these bad elements of society. You know, we hear that, you know, everyone was in the mode of goodness in Satya Yuga. Well, obviously not everyone. So it's just like we meet other personalities like this in the Bhagavatam. You remember the Python man? You know, whatever happens, if they come and give me something to eat, I'll eat. Otherwise, you know, he's completely indifferent to what was going on. And, you know, it's rare that you find this level of indifference and tolerance and description of this. But this consciousness, what's being emphasized here, is that he was completely on the spiritual platform. And he was just unconcerned about what was going on in terms of insults or physical, you know, insults or whatever, you know, throwing stool at him, spitting at him, whatever. And he maintained that transcendence. Now we may develop a certain amount of tolerance. We have to develop tolerance in order to progress in devotional service. But there's usually a limit, you know. If you know, we planned it out. It's Lord Nrsingadeva's appearance day, and we had to serve out, so we had our plate saved, you know, and then there was a wonderful feast, and then we get to the plate, and someone took our prasadam, and who is it? Who took my prasadam? You know, I've been fasting all day. You know, there's a certain limit. But there's no limit here. This is about as insulted as you could be and disrespected. But he didn't care for any of the insults. He was in a completely on the Brahmabhuta platform, transcendental. So what does this mean for us? Well, Prabhupada quotes this Matra Sparshasta Kaunteya verse, which certainly pertains to us. This verse is very near the beginning of Lord Krishna's instructions to Arjuna. And he's explained to him in the previous verse that Dehinosminyata Dehe, that we're all getting, transmigration is happening even within this one body. And then at the end you get another body. Now why is he telling him this? The external purpose, besides instructing everyone else about the transmigration, is that he wants to try to get him away from this idea of being completely fixated on the form of his wonderful teacher, Dronacharya, and Bhishmadev, the grandfather who he highly respected and loved, and all of these other relatives, So everybody's going to get another body. Nobody dies. That's one of the things. And Krishna keeps emphasizing that. And finally, the verse probably would always quote from this chapter, the Jayate Mriyate Vakadacha, But in spite of that fact, still there's a certain amount of attachment. Even we find when devotees leave their bodies, there's a tremendous sense of loss. That's why we have these memorials and and we have pictures and so many things, because there was a relationship there, spiritual, hopefully, totally that. But you miss the person. There's no question about it. So therefore, one has to learn how to tolerate these things without losing one's equilibrium. That phrase keeps coming up. That word. Equipoised, which no one knew. They started out with equiposed, but the idea is equipoise means that dhira. This is what dhira means. Equipoise, I think it can be pronounced either way. Equipoise, equipoise. So this is one has to be dhira, which comes up in the next verse of the Bhagavad Gita, 22:15. Yamin abhidhyante te purusham purushashabha samadukha sukham dhiram somitadvaya kalpate. All of these pleasures and pains, and he mentioned pleasure and pain because that's also a diversion. If one gets allured by the opposite sex or some other sense gratification, that's also that's a fall down, as much as if one can't tolerate the negative side. We have to be able to tolerate the pains and the pleasures, and keep our equilibrium. And one who does, then they're eligible for liberation. So the Rishabhadeva is showing the extreme example of this. He never even deviated one iota from his equipoise. That's the whole idea. It didn't bother him, all of these negative things that were happening. And I'm sure, I forget if it describes here, also, allurements may come for enjoyment. That also didn't move him. It's just like a stone, just like we say irrevocable devotional service. That's the Nishta platform. In those verses in the second chapter, it's describing how Shunbatam Sukata Krishna Punyashavana Kirtana. That when one hears about Krishna from the proper source, and one was eager to hear and absorbed in the hearing, and Krishna within the heart, he cleanses away the abhadras. Not all at once, but he cleanses, and you make progress that way. Your lust, anger, greed, illusion, madness, envy, those things are all decreasing, and you're feeling much more free from the bondage of the material energy. And then at a certain point, Nashtapraya Nityam Bhagavata Sevya, when these are destroyed, it says almost to nil. Prabhupada said it's 75% at least, then one becomes fixed in goodness. And you're on a Nishta platform that Rupa Goswami describes in his description from faith to love. So what is the quality of that Nishta platform? Is your faith is grown, and your confidence that just by Krishna consciousness, all my desires will be fulfilled. Shraddha Shabde Vishwas Kare Sudra Danishtroy, Krishna Bhakti Kore Sarva Karma Katahoy. Lord Chaitanya gave this definition to Sanatana Goswami when he's giving him his teachings. So real Shraddha, mature Shraddha, means that you know that there's really nothing else to do in this world of any meaning except Krishna consciousness. And so you're living, you have to eat, you have to sleep, these things are going on in a minimal way, but even those are done for the purpose of devotional service because your whole being is dedicated to Krishna service. So it's like putting gas in the car when you eat. Well, there's a machine, I got to take it, I got to give it rest, So therefore you're fixed. And in that position, then you become much more tolerant of both sides. Of the allurements, they can't allure you. In other words, and people insult you and so forth, which is going to happen. Any preacher that's is going to face these negative things. That also can't shake your determination or disturb you. I remember I was once walking with a devotee back from the Philadelphia temple to the house we were staying in, which was about a mile from the temple. It was bought by a devotee, and that's where the BI and then later the BTG had its offices in Philadelphia back in the early 80s. And so we missed our car, a ride or something. We were staying in the temple, so we had to, a little longer, so we had to walk. It's about a mile, no big deal. And so we're walking along. He was a brahmachari, I was a brahmin. And someone gave some kind of cat call, some insult. And I said, okay. I was walking along, and this devotee just freaked out, started yelling at him, insulting him, I said, oh boy, he's going to have trouble, continuing a devotional service with that attitude. And he didn't stay much longer. This is the nature of this material world, is that there are going to be physical insults to the body, difficulties. There are going to be emotional attacks. There are going to be mental things. All kinds of things are going to happen. Your own body often fails to do what you want it to do. Disease comes. That's another thing you got to tolerate. And continue the service. Somehow continue the service. Even if it's just chanting or even just lying in your bed, remembering Krishna, listening to that tape again and again. No more tape, sorry, recordings. Or, somehow or other you have to keep your remembrance of Krishna. That's the whole idea. So here we see a perfect example. Of course, it's Krishna himself, but he often gives that example, as Nityananda did. Nityananda, Supreme Personality of Godhead. And yet, he went out to preach on Lord Chaitanya's order, and he chose the most unlikely candidates, Jai and Vijay. And you know what happened the first time? They started, he gave him the order that Lord Chaitanya had said. Bhajo Krishna, Bolo Krishna, Bhajo Krishna, Koro Krishna Shika. Just chant Shri Krishna's name and worship him with all your heart. Follow his instructions and to others them impart. That last part is for the preachers. But those three things. Chant Shri Krishna's name and worship him with all your heart and follow his instructions. That's the last thing that Jai and Vijay wanted. Jai and Vijay. Jagai Madai wanted to hear. They are Jai and Vijay. That's another story. So they were completely intolerant, and they were drunk, and they went after him. And Nityananda and Haridas were running, the whole story. But then later on, he went back. He says, okay, well, we know we're not going to get any, distribute any holy names over there. We'll give him a white. No, those are the ones he specifically went to, knowing that this is a representative of Kali Yuga. That if they can be delivered, Lord Chaitanya will be glorified. He regarded him as his master. And the movement can actually go on. So he specifically went to them, told them to chant again. This time he was physically injured, just like everything's being thrown here. And he didn't flinch. He said, at that time he said, okay, I may be bleeding. Blood is flowing everywhere. But please chant Hare Krishna. So again, Madai was in his mood of rage. He's going to throw a big pot at this time. Probably would have been fatal, so-called. But what happened? Who remembers? Jagai grabbed his arm. Are you crazy? Come on, he's a saintly person. In other words, he was sane enough. They were Brahmins. They had been Brahmins before. There was some training. So that was Jagai's saving grace, and went on. By that time, Lord Chaitanya arrived. You know the whole story. But the whole point here is being tolerant, being fixed in our position as devotees, transcendental, so that these physical, mental, emotional injuries will not deviate us from the path, will not discourage us. And this is an extreme example by Lord Rishabhadeva, how one can truly rise if one is praying to Krishna at every moment and calling out from the bottom of his heart the holy name. Then you can tolerate practically anything. And we've seen devotees do that. We heard, oh no, where did I hear it? I was listening to Bhakti Vikas Swami's description. He has this series on guru problems. It was interesting. And anyway, it's fascinating. Did you read, seeing some of it? Wasn't he describing in Russia how some of the devotees were arrested, some were actually killed and executed, so many things. And yet that yatra is one of the strongest yatras. I met some of those devotees. I was there who not who were killed obviously, but who had been imprisoned and were later released. And they were very, very strong devotees. They had been able to chant and pray and tolerate and somehow get through that experience. It made them very strong. So you may know some of those. I mean, you've heard of it, I'm sure, from Russia. Yeah, a little bit. So the idea is that this is the nature, especially of Kali Yuga, is that what is Kali Yuga? Kali Yuga is the age of Kali, when devotional service becomes eclipsed, when we can just see the modes of passion and ignorance become very prominent, people become controlled by that, and just as Hiranyakashipu was like a kicked snake when his son was preaching to him about Krishna, the last thing he wanted to hear, and he became, like an executioner of his own son. This is how crazy it can get. So, in this mad world, we're trying to be a force for sanity. And we need to have our armor on all the time, especially when we go out, in this world, so that we can maintain our Krishna consciousness even in negative circumstances. Prabhupada certainly showed that. If he hadn't tolerated all kinds of things, maybe not exactly on the level of Rishabhadeva, but there was plenty, even several threats to his life, and so many problems in the society itself that he had to tolerate. And yet he never gave up. He always was fixed on the order of his spiritual master, and even he was surprised by the success that he was able to engender, and that's why we're sitting here today. So this is it's a lesson here. I mean, it's an extreme lesson, but it's a lesson nonetheless that in the course of practicing our devotional service, there are going to be all kinds of challenges. There are going to be challenges, internal challenges, doubts, allurements for sense gratification, people who we once respected are being very critical, our former friends, not caring about us, or whatever. And through all of those, if we water the seed of the Bhakti creeper nicely, and we're progressing, then you develop spiritual muscles and armor that allows you to take refuge of Krishna's lotus feet and the devotees and the deities and to weather the storm, and you become stronger by that. As even on the material plane, if you're able to go through a trial or a test, then you become stronger. So that's one of the lessons here. Okay, any questions or comments on this verse or this verse? We have some. Yeah, then we can. I don't know if we have any remote listeners today.
Yes, remote listeners are here.
Okay, just hang on, Brijay. We have.
Yes, Prabhu, I can wait. No problem.
In terms of material desires, and because you said tolerating, there's two, right? You tolerate the pain, and then tolerate the allurements.
Yeah.
So you have the case, Haridas Thakur is a perfect example of that. You brought up
Both sides.
Both sides. I was just thinking about that case when Srila Prabhupada was in Mayapur, and apparently there was a young man, and he said something to Srila Prabhupada that I'm absolutely free from sex desire. Yeah. And Prabhupada said, "Oh, are you okay? You need to go to the doctor," or
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe you could comment on that, like what maybe you could just comment on that exchange that Srila Prabhupada had, and what was, because there could be people interpret things differently or they see things differently, so that could be seen from different angles of vision. Maybe you could comment on that.
Well, I wasn't there, and there's probably a backstory who he is, what his history had been and what so forth, but. I think Prabhupada, of course, he knew his disciples very well, and he knew the difficulties that you can encounter. And I think what he was saying there is that
don't be so cocky. Forgive that, no pun intended. Don't be so cocky and think that you've transcended sex life so easily. In other words, the devotee was probably in the movement 3 years or something, you know. And he was, even if he was feeling like that, he shouldn't have been proclaiming it to the world, because you're setting yourself up. You're setting yourself up for great embarrassment. So I think he was saying it's not so easy to transcend sex desire. You may think that you're free now, you know, just like in a big kirtan. You know, if you're really into the whole, you're not thinking of sex desire. I always give this example. Forgive me, you've all heard it about 5 times at least. Harinam, New Year's Eve, a few years ago. You know, I would sometimes lead the kirtan. So we come upon a corner. You know, it's New Year's Eve. It's getting to be 12 o'clock, and there's a passel of what Prabhupada would call society ladies. You know what I mean? Polite term. Very scantily dressed, you know, and kind of, you know, throwing it around. And so, and here we are in the, you know, absorbed in the holy name. And I didn't feel any attraction. I was feeling kind of sorry for them, that they felt they had to do this in order to attract. You know what I'm saying? And that comes up all the time. If you're really absorbed in Krishna consciousness, then you can tolerate both sides much easier. But yeah, well, we can be absorbed in Krishna consciousness 1 minute and then not absorbed the next, and then suddenly there's attachment. And we find that as I think you mentioned in your last class about how we had so many sannyasis. Prabhupada gave sannyas, you know, because it's good for the preaching, you know, it's necessary, you know. But then they had trouble at one point. So at one point they felt, yeah, I can do this. I'm renounced, you know, I'm chanting Hare Krishna and so forth. But then something happens, and usually what happens, you know, you get tangled up in management, you know, which is a big distraction. You have to deal with that. And your time is taken. And so your sadhana becomes weak. You don't have time to chant your rounds, or at least good rounds. You're chanting your rounds, and then here you are on the East Coast. It's 9:30 over there. You know, on the East Coast now, it's only 6:30 here, the middle of japa period. And what to speak of Europe now, you got a world. And the things are going, and there's an emergency, you know, and what can do? What can we do, Maharaj, you know? So your mind is distracted, and your sadhana is damaged. I've seen it myself back in 73, 74. With anyway, I won't get into names, but so this is what Prabhupada was seeing. You know, it's not so easy to transcend sex desire for good, you know. And this is what's really valuable. What's dangerous is saying, yeah, I'm feeling transcendental now, you know. And then you can feel, yeah, I can do anything. I can talk to this lady. I can approach this person. I can do this. So it's cautionary for all of those who hear the pastime. Anything else? Vijay, you're on. Vijay Krishna. Hello.
Hare Krishna, Dravida Prabhu. Thank you very much. If I may,
Please.
Quote from.
Go ahead.
Thank you. The quote from the translation related to text 30 is as follows, quote, "Thus people called him many bad names and gave him a great deal of trouble. But he did not care about this, for he understood that the body is simply meant for such an end." End quote. So Prabhu, this quote confuses me in the following manner. I thought that the body is simply meant for one only end, and which is the execution of pure devotional service. But here I see that in accordance with this quote, the body is meant for one end only, which is taking care of the troubles and impediments that could be there happening while we are walking on the path of pure devotional service. So could you help me?
I think you're a little confused here. What Prabhupada means here. Those people called him many bad names and gave him a great deal of trouble, but he did not care about this, for he understood that the body is simply meant for such an end. And what I get from that, because classically, what is the body meant for? Okay, if it's burned, it turns to ashes. If you bury it, it turns to stool of a worm or something. It can be eaten by the vultures. In other words, it's meant for a very lowly end. This body that probably what it says in one lecture that you're soaping so nicely, So how does that fit into this? They call him many bad names, gave him a great deal of trouble. In other words, disrespected it. The body ultimately has to be rejected, neglected, burned. You have to dispose of it somehow. That's the fact, no matter whose body it is. So his body was being disrespected here while he was still in it as a soul, and he regarded it. Well, okay, I'm not the body. I'm not at all related to this body. I'm completely aloof. That's our situation too. The whole illusion is that we are the body and we identify with it. Then you're very sensitive to the pleasures and the pains. It's a little too hot, a little too cold, You're very body conscious. So in his case, he was as little body conscious as is possible to be. He was completely identified with himself as soul, pure soul, spirit, supreme personality of Godhead. So he wasn't troubled by it. It's just like if suppose you die, and then you're able to see, and this happens all the time. I mean, even people come back into the body who almost die. Everyone's heard of these things, near-death experiences. And what was going on? Well, the doctors were working, trying to, pumping you up. You're getting epinephrine, and it worked this time. So you get sucked back in the body, and you're alive and wake up in there, and you can tell. So, but suppose you do die. Suppose you actually die. So then, but you're still hovering, I once read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the different bardos, So let's assume that happens. You're also looking at it. This is one of the reasons they burn the body in India, because you're still hanging around, you're attached to it. If the body is burned, well, it breaks the attachment. So the idea is that the body is meant for a lowly end. The doctors try to revive you, but they don't. So then what happens? All right, let's call it. I used to be in a hospital. We'll call it, then you look at the time. Okay, 1:30 a.m., so-and-so died, and they put it on the list. Then they all leave the room to go to the next one. And they pull out the plugs, and you're just lying there. In other words, it's neglected, and then it's put in the morgue. In other words, so it's equivalent to this. And you're still watching. So he's saying, well, it's going to happen sooner or later anyway, so I don't care about now, let it be neglected now. He's completely in the spiritual world, So that's what I get from this. Such an end means that the body will be disrespected and neglected. And so that's, I think you had a different view of it, misinterpreted. That's about the best I can do, Vijay.
Yes, very best. Thank you very much, Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. It's almost 8:30. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hare Hare Bol.